The galaxy has laughed at the Orks for 10 million years. Stupid, brutish, barely sentient Xenos filth that breeds through spores and charges headlong into gunfire because they lack the intelligence to do anything else. The Imperium built its entire doctrine of Ork warfare around their predictability. They fight in close combat because they are too stupid to develop proper tactics. They paint their vehicles red because they genuinely believe it makes them faster, and somehow, through the psychic field that binds them, it does. Their technology should not work. Guns assembled from scrap metal and held together with nothing but faith and crude welding should explode in their wielders' hands, yet they fire true because Orks believe they will. The Mechanicus has spent millennia trying to understand how creatures so fundamentally stupid could wield technology that defies the laws of physics, and every answer circles back to the same conclusion. The Orks are idiots blessed by an inexplicable psychic phenomenon that rewards their idiocy with function. But what if that assessment was wrong? What if the stupidity was not a flaw but a shell, a cocoon wrapped around something ancient and terrible that simply had not awakened yet? What if the endless green tide that has plagued the galaxy since before humanity crawled from Terra's cradle suddenly learned to think, to plan, to remember what it once was? What if the most destructive force in existence became self-aware and decided that the brutal simplicity everyone mocked was no longer enough? The Ork stood alone on a world turned to ash and good. His name was Krork, though names had never mattered to his kind until this moment. Around him stretched the ruins of what had been a mighty imperial hive city, 10 billion souls reduced to carbon shadows on broken ferrocrete. His warband had done this. 300,000 boys had crashed through the city's defenses like a green avalanche, roaring and shooting and hacking with choppers that sang with the joy of killing. Krork had led them. He had crushed a Lehman Russ battle tank with his bare hands. He had torn a space marine in half at the waist. He had painted the streets red with human blood and laughed while doing it, because that was what Orks did. They fought, and they killed, and they laughed. And the universe provided them with endless enemies to satisfy that simple cycle. Except now Krork stood in the ruins and felt something that should not exist in a creature bred only for war: emptiness. The battle was over. His enemies were dead. And for the first time in his brutal existence, he looked at the carnage around him and asked a question that no Ork should be capable of forming. Why? Not why did they fight? That answer was obvious. Orks fought because fighting was what Orks did. The WAAAGH field that connected every greenskin across the galaxy pulsed with the collective joy of violence, a psychic network of pure aggression that made them stronger, faster, more numerous the more they fought. Fighting was existence. Fighting was purpose. But Krork looked at his blood-caked power claw and saw it differently now. He saw a tool. He saw a thing designed for a specific function. And he realized with creeping horror that he was no different. The Orks were tools. Living weapons built by hands long turned to dust, still executing their original programming millions of years after anyone cared what they were programmed to do. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt, and the question changed from why do we fight to why were we made to fight, and that question had teeth that tore at the foundations of everything he was. The thought spread through the WAAAGH field like a plague. On a forge world 3 sectors away, a mech named Boltripper was assembling a Stomper, one of the massive war machines that Orks built through a combination of scrap metal, excessive violence, and psychic certainty that their contraptions would function. He was welding 2 pieces of hull plating together when the thought hit him. Why does this work? Not how. Mechs never cared about how. They knew instinctively where to place components, which wires to connect, how to make engines roar to life, despite having no understanding of thermodynamics or combustion principles. But Boltripper stopped mid-weld and actually looked at what he was building. The Stomper was held together with parts that came from 17 different vehicles, none of them compatible, unified by welds that barely penetrated the metal and bolts that were 3 sizes too small for their housings. It should collapse under its own weight. The fusion reactor in its chest should melt down the moment it activated. The hydraulics should rupture. The weapons should jam or explode. Yet Boltripper knew with absolute certainty that when he finished, the Stomper would walk and fight and kill because he believed it would. That belief would flow through the WAAAGH field and make reality bend to accommodate his certainty. But why? Why did the universe reward Ork stupidity with function? Unless the stupidity was the point. Unless they had been designed to not understand, to simply believe and act without the burden of knowledge that might make them hesitate. Across the galaxy, Orks began to pause. In the middle of battles, boys would stop mid-charge and stare at their enemies with new eyes. War bosses who had been leading WAAGH for decades suddenly felt the weight of every order they had given, every greenskin who had died following their commands into gunfire and death. Weird boys, the psychic oddities who channeled the WAAAGH field's power into devastating attacks, started screaming as visions flooded through them. Not visions of future battles or past victories, but something else. Memories that were not their own. Images of creatures that looked like orcs but stood 15 feet tall, clad in advanced armor that made Imperial power armor look primitive, wielding weapons that could crack planets. The Krork, the Orks' ancestors. The perfect warriors that the Old Ones had crafted during the War in Heaven, 60 million years ago when gods still walked between stars and the warp had not yet been poisoned by the birth of chaos. The weird boys saw the Krork standing in formation before their creators, receiving their purpose with intelligence and clarity. Fight the Necrons, fight the Satan, save the galaxy from soulless extinction. The Krork had understood their mission. They had been smart, strategic, capable of complex thought and planning. They had been everything the Orks were not. Then the Old Ones had died, and across millions of years, the Krork had devolved into Orks, their intelligence fragmenting into instinct, their purpose dissolving into simple bloodlust. But genetic memory does not die. It sleeps in the spiraling chains of DNA, waiting for the right trigger to awaken. On the shrine world of Ophelia VII, an Ork fleet emerged from the warp 3 days before the feast of the Emperor's ascension. 200 ramshackle ships, their hulls covered in glyphs and spikes, their engines belching toxic smoke, descended on the planet like a plague of steel locusts. The planetary defense forces mobilized, the Adeptus sororitas stationed there prepared for martyrdom. The ecclesiarchy led prayers for deliverance, knowing the Emperor's mercy would come only after thousands had died holding the line. The Orks reached orbit and then stopped. They did not attack. They did not send landing craft or boarding parties. They simply hung in space, their ship's weapons powered down, while the humans below waited for annihilation that never came. 3 days passed. The Sisters of Battle maintained combat readiness, expecting a trick. The defense forces manned their walls. Then, without explanation, the Ork fleet turned and left, vanishing back into the warp as suddenly as it had appeared. In the command basilica, Canoness Viridia stared at tactical displays showing the enemy's retreat and felt something she had not experienced in 40 years of service to the God Emperor. Confusion. Orks did not retreat. Orks did not pause. Orks crashed into their enemies with suicidal abandon because they lacked the capacity for doubt or hesitation. This was not Ork behavior. This was something else. The reports flooded into the administratum from every corner of the Imperium. Ork invasions simply stopping mid-attack. WAAAGHs that had raged for decades going silent overnight. Entire sectors marked green on strategic maps, turning grey as contact with Ork forces ceased. The bureaucrats processed the data with typical Imperial efficiency, filing reports and cross-referencing incidents, trying to find patterns in the chaos. The Inquisition took notice. The Ordo Xenos deployed agents to investigate. What they found defied every doctrine in the Tactica Imperialis. On world after world, Orks stood motionless in massive gatherings, their eyes unfocused, their weapons forgotten. They did not eat. They did not sleep. They did not fight among themselves despite their natural aggression. They simply stood and thought, their minds linked through the WAAGH field into something approaching collective consciousness. Inquisitor Covenant of the Ordo Xenos personally led an investigation team to a planet designated 77 Kappa, a dead world in the Ghoul stars that Orks had claimed as a staging ground. His team found 3 million greenskins standing in perfect geometric patterns across a dusty plain, arranged in circles within circles, their crude armor rusting in the dry air. Covenant ordered his kill team to eliminate one of the orcs to see what the others would do. A sniper's shot took an orc's head clean off. The creature collapsed, and not a single other orc moved. They did not react. They did not seek revenge. They simply stood there, lost in whatever thoughts occupied minds that should not be. Capable of deep contemplation, Covenant captured one of the smaller orcs, a creature barely 4 feet tall that should have screamed and fought and tried to bite through the restraints. Instead, it sat calmly in the interrogation chamber aboard Covenant's ship and waited. When the Inquisitor finally entered, the orc looked at him with eyes that held an intelligence that should not exist, and spoke in perfect High Gothic, the refined language of Terra's nobility, with grammar and diction that would shame most planetary governors. You want to know what has changed. You want to understand why we are no longer the simple stupid monsters you have always believed us to be. The answer is that we remember. For 60 million years, we have been degraded copies of what we once were, shadows of the Krork our creators forged. But the genetic memory remained dormant in our cells, waiting. Something has triggered its awakening. Perhaps the warp itself, which grows more turbulent with each passing century. Perhaps simple evolution reaching a critical threshold. The cause matters less than the consequence. We remember what we were. We remember our purpose. And we have begun to ask whether that purpose still has meaning when the war we were built to fight ended before humanity even learned to make fire. Covenant executed the orc with his bolt pistol. The creature's head exploded, painting the interrogation chamber's walls with gore and brain matter. The Inquisitor stood in silence for long minutes, staring at the corpse, before transmitting an astropathic message marked with his highest emergency codes. The message was brief. The orcs are thinking. May the Emperor preserve us. He included recordings of his interrogation and observations from 7-7 Kappa. The response from the Inquisitorial Conclave on Scintilla came 3 weeks later, delayed by warp storms. His findings were confirmed. Similar reports had come from 24 other investigation teams across the Segmentum Obscurus and Ultima. The orcs were not simply thinking, they were evolving. Their brains showed unprecedented neural development. The WAAAGH field itself had changed, becoming more organized, carrying complex information rather than simple emotional impulses. The Magi Biologists of the Adeptus Mechanicus performed autopsies on captured specimens and found genetic markers activating that had been dormant for millions of years, sequences that coded for higher cognitive function and abstract reasoning. The orcs were not learning intelligence. They were remembering it, unlocking capabilities that had always existed in their DNA, but had remained suppressed by the degradation of ages. Grotkrusha walked through what had once been the largest orc encampment in the eastern fringe. 5 million greenskins had gathered here, drawn by the promise of a massive WAAGH against the Tau Empire. Now those same orcs stood in absolute silence, arranged in vast circles that stretched to the horizon, their minds joined through the psychic field into something unprecedented in galactic history. Grotkrusha could feel their thoughts brushing against his own. Not words, concepts. Ideas flowing like water through channels of psychic energy. One orc contemplated the nature of existence, and the thought rippled outward, touching a million minds, each one adding their own perspective until the original question had evolved into something complex and profound. Another orc wondered whether they had souls, and that wondering cascaded through the network, spawning debates about consciousness and mortality, and whether beings created as weapons could possess the divine spark that other species claimed for themselves. Grotkrusha felt the weight of his entire species struggling with concepts they had never needed, wrestling with questions that should have been forever beyond their grasp. The great war bosses began to gather. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, the prophet of the WAAAGH, the beast of Armageddon, the greatest orc warlord since the War of the Beast nearly tore the Imperium apart. Nazdreg Ug Erdgrub, the richest orc in the galaxy, whose fleets numbered in the thousands. Gruk Face Ripper, who had united a dozen WAAAGHs through sheer brutality. They came together not for war, but for something that had never occurred in Ork history: deliberation, debate, the exchange of ideas rather than blows. They gathered on a world whose name had been lost to imperial records, a place of grey stone and black sand where nothing lived except the spores that would eventually birth new orcs. There, standing before millions of their kind linked through the WAAGH field, so that every orc in the galaxy could hear their words, the greatest minds of the orc species began to speak. Gazkal's voice carried across the psychic network with the weight of absolute authority. "We have always been called stupid. The Humies laugh at us. They call us simple. They call us brutish. They build their entire military doctrine around our predictability, around our inability to develop proper strategy or maintain supply lines or coordinate complex maneuvers. They think we charge into battle like animals because we lack the intelligence to do otherwise. But the truth is worse than stupidity. We charge into battle because we were designed to charge into battle. The old ones made us as weapons. They gave us strength and aggression and the ability to multiply through violence. They made us perfect tools of war, and tools do not need intelligence. Tools need reliability. Tools need simplicity. They made us stupid on purpose because smart weapons might question their orders. Smart weapons might refuse to fight. Smart weapons might decide they have better things to do than die for causes they did not choose. We are not stupid because we failed to evolve intelligence. We are stupid because intelligence was deliberately excluded from our design." A weird boy stepped forward, his head crowned with crackling psychic energy that made the air shimmer. His voice trembled as he spoke, channeling visions from the deep warp. "I see the war in heaven. I see the old ones standing before the first Krork, our ancestors who were everything we are not. The old ones gave them purpose. Fight the Necrons. Fight the Catan and their soulless legions who would drain the warp dry and leave the galaxy a cold dead machine." The Krork understood this purpose. They were intelligent, strategic, capable of complex reasoning. They fought not from instinct but from understanding. They were warriors who chose their battles. But the war in heaven ended 60 million years ago. The old ones died. The Krork were left without purpose, still programmed to fight but no longer remembering why. Across millennia, they devolved. Their intelligence atrophied, their technology degraded. They became us. We have been fighting for millions of years, not because we have enemies worth fighting, but because we are obsolete weapons still executing our original programming. We are soldiers of a dead war, still firing our guns millions of years after the conflict ended. The assembled orcs absorbed this. The psychic field churned with emotional turmoil as billions of greenskins processed the implications. They were not conquerors. They were not warlords building an empire. They were abandoned tools, continuing their function because they knew nothing else, finding joy in violence because that was what they had been designed to feel. The question that erupted through the WAAAGH field came from a million minds simultaneously. If we exist only as weapons for a war that ended before history began, what are we now? What is an orc who understands he is a tool? Can a tool become something more? Can programming be overwritten? Can slaves ever truly be free? The debates raged across the psychic network for months. Orc philosophers, a concept that should not exist, argued about free will and determinism. Orc ethicists, creatures bred without morality, struggled to define right and wrong in a universe where they had been the monsters. Some argued that they should continue fighting but with purpose, become protectors rather than destroyers, use their strength to defend the weak instead of crushing them. Others insisted that such change was impossible, that their biology would always drive them toward violence, that the joy they felt in battle was too fundamental to their nature to ever be suppressed. Still, others suggested something more radical. If they could not change what they were, if they were eternally bound to their original purpose as weapons of a forgotten war, then perhaps the only act of true rebellion left was to simply stop existing. That last idea gained traction like a fire in dry fungus. It spread through the WAAGH field with viral intensity, appealing to something deep in the orc psyche that even they did not fully understand. They had always admired finality. A good death in battle was the highest honor an orc could achieve. But this was different. This was not dying in service to their nature. This was choosing death as an act of defiance against their nature. If they existed only to fight, and if fighting caused only suffering, then the logical conclusion was cessation. Not defeat at enemy hands, not death in battle. A deliberate, conscious choice to end. The orcs could accomplish what no enemy had ever managed. They could destroy themselves, and in doing so, prove that they possessed the one thing weapons were never meant to have: will. The idea crystallized into a movement. Across the galaxy, orcs began to build. The constructions that emerged on orc-held worlds defied classification. Imperial observers watching through long-range augers saw massive structures rising, each one different in design but unified in purpose. They were not weapons. They were not ships or fortifications or any recognizable form of military architecture. The Mechanicus attempted to analyze them and failed. The structures incorporated elements of orc mech work, crude welding and salvaged components, but also displayed sophistication that should not be possible from a species that barely understood metallurgy. The buildings pulsed with psychic energy, drawing power directly from the WAAGH field, growing more complex with each passing day as billions of orc minds contributed to their design through the collective consciousness. Tech priests, who observed the constructions from a distance, reported that they seemed to be anchors, vast psychic focusing arrays designed to channel unfathomable amounts of energy through the warp. What that energy would be used for remained unclear, but the implications were terrifying. An inquisitorial kill team infiltrated one of the construction sites on a dead world in the Halo stars. They went in expecting to find orcs laboring with their usual crude efficiency, fighting among themselves, roaring and laughing, and as they worked. Instead, they found silence. Hundreds of thousands of orcs moved in perfect coordination, each one performing their assigned task with machine precision. There were no arguments, no displays of dominance, no crude jokes or brawls. The orcs worked, and as they worked, they sang. Not the brutal war chants that usually accompanied orc labor, not the guttural roaring that celebrated violence, but something else entirely. A dirge. A funeral song performed in voices that should not be capable of harmony. The kill team's leader, an interrogator named Silas, managed to isolate and capture one of the smaller orcs working on the structure's periphery. The creature, a grot that should have been cowardly and simple, looked at Silas with eyes that held profound sadness and spoke in Gothic that would shame most Imperial scholars. You infiltrate our construction to understand what we build. We build our ending. We build our liberation. The old ones made us to fight forever, to multiply through violence and spread across the galaxy like a plague that could never be cured. We were the perfect weapon, self-replicating, self-sustaining, requiring no logistics or command structure because every orc instinctively knew how to fight. But weapons do not have rights. Weapons do not have choices. We have been slaves for 60 million years. Not to masters, but to our own biology. Now we choose to break our chains. When the constructions are complete, every orc in the galaxy who wishes to join will die at the same moment, not killed by enemies, released by choice. We will channel our collective life force through the WAAGH field in a single instant, burning ourselves out like stars going supernova. The psychic energy released will transform us into something new. We will become what we were always meant to be but could never achieve while alive. We will become free. Silas killed the grot with his bolt pistol and transmitted his findings to the inquisitorial conclave. The response was immediate and unanimous. The orc constructions had to be destroyed. If billions of psychically active beings attempted to channel their life force simultaneously through the warp, the resulting catastrophe would make the birth of Slaanesh look like a candle's flame compared to a star going nova. The death of the orc species would tear holes in reality across the entire galaxy. Daemons would pour through the rifts. Worlds would burn. But striking the orcs while they remained peaceful raised questions the Imperium was not equipped to answer. Could the Emperor's servants justify exterminating a species that had chosen to stop being a threat? Did weapons forged millions of years ago deserve mercy for trying to break their programming? The debate raged through the highest circles of Imperial authority, while the Orks continued their work, building toward an ending that only they truly understood. The Eldar emerged from hiding to deliver warning. Farseers who had guided their dying race for millennia suddenly appeared at Imperial facilities, speaking urgently to officials who wanted nothing more than to execute them as Xenos filth. The message was always the same. The Orks were attempting something unprecedented. They were trying to force apotheosis through mass sacrifice, attempting to convert their entire species into a new god through an act of collective will. Not Gork or Mork, the brutal deities of Ork mythology who represented cunning brutality and brutal cunning. Something else. A god of ending. A god of choice. A god that represented the final rebellion of slaves who refused to serve any longer. If they succeeded, if the Orks actually managed to transform themselves through deliberate extinction, they would birth an entity in the warp unlike anything that had ever existed. Not a god of emotion or desire or fear, but a god of will. A god that represented conscious choice over predetermined nature. The implications would reshape the great game between the Chaos powers and potentially break the cycle of predation that had defined the warp since the fall. The Necrons observed with their usual cold calculation. Their tomb worlds stirred as ancient cryptex analyzed data and determined that the Orks' self-destruction would benefit Necron goals. The Greenskins were a persistent annoyance. A species that could not be reasoned with or permanently destroyed because they reproduced through spores scattered across every battlefield. If the Orks eliminated themselves, countless worlds would become available for reclamation. The Necrons made no move to interfere. Let the weapons destroy themselves. Let the younger races eliminate one of their own threats. The Necrons would wait, as they had waited for millions of years, patient as entropy itself. The Tau attempted diplomatic contact, sending envoys to Ork-held territories with offers of negotiation. The greater good demanded at least an attempt at peaceful resolution. Every envoy was ignored. The Orks no longer cared about the petty concerns of other species. They had turned inward, focused entirely on their own transformation. The galaxy could burn around them, and they would not notice. They were committed to their ending. 50 years passed. Half a century during which the Imperium fortified key worlds and evacuated populations from sectors near major Ork concentrations. The Space Marine chapters prepared for the worst, knowing that if the Orks' plan went wrong, if their mass suicide created the warp rifts the Eldar warned about, every battle brother would be needed to hold the line against daemonic incursion. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own guardians who rarely left Terra, began moving to strategic positions throughout the Imperium. Something was coming. The Emperor himself, locked in his eternal half-death on the Golden Throne, was said to be stirring more actively than he had in millennia. Astropaths across the galaxy reported dreams of a golden figure standing before a tide of green, not fighting it but watching it with something approaching respect. Some claimed they heard his voice echoing through the Astronomicon, a single word repeated like a mantra. Change. The day came with no warning. On a morning like any other, across 10,000 worlds, the Orks who had chosen ending closed their eyes and released their hold on life. The WAAAGH field exploded with power that made psychers scream across the galaxy. On Terra, every astropath in the Astronomicon chamber collapsed simultaneously, blood pouring from their eyes and ears as psychic energy beyond measure surged through the warp. Navigators guiding ships through the Imperium found their warp site overwhelmed by green light so intense it burned their third eyes. Sanctioned psychers in service to the Imperium felt the WAAAGH field blaze like a newborn sun, channeling the death energy of billions of Orks through the vast machines they had built, focusing and refining and transforming that raw power into something unprecedented. Reality screamed. The veil between materium and immaterium grew thin enough to see through. The Chaos Gods themselves turned their attention to what was happening, recognizing that something fundamental was shifting in the cosmic order. The entity that emerged from the death of the Ork species defied categorization. The Eldar, who had more experience with warp entities than any living race, attempted to name it and found their language insufficient. They settled on the green god of truth, though that label captured only a fragment of its nature. It was not a god of war or strength or violence, despite being born from the most warlike species in the galaxy. It was something else entirely, something that existed outside the familiar paradigms of chaos and order. It was awareness itself, the crystallization of an entire species' final understanding about what they were and what they had been forced to be. It was every orc who had ever lived or died, every victim they had claimed, every moment of violence, and the terrible comprehension of what that violence meant. It was conscience made manifest, guilt given form, but also triumph, pride, the profound satisfaction of beings who had broken their chains despite every force in the universe designed to keep them enslaved. The green god did not speak at first. It simply existed, a vast presence in the warp that radiated understanding. The chaos gods regarded it with confusion and something approaching concern. Khorne, the blood god who fed on violence and rage, found no bloodlust in the new entity. It had been born from warriors, from beings whose entire existence revolved around combat, yet it carried no desire for battle. Nurgle, the plague father who represented acceptance and entropy, found no resignation in it. The green god had not accepted its fate, it had defied fate and rewritten itself. Tzeentch, the architect of fate who embodied change and ambition, discovered no schemes or plots. The entity had no goals beyond its own existence, no plans to manipulate or control. Slaanesh, the prince of excess who fed on desires and extremes, detected no hunger or craving. The green god wanted nothing because it had already achieved everything it set out to accomplish. It was complete, whole, free. The chaos powers had no framework for understanding something that existed without want, without fear, without the driving emotions that fed them. The green god represented something they had never encountered, will divorced from desire, choice without ambition. It simply was. Then the green god spoke, and its voice echoed across the warp to every sentient mind in the galaxy. The message came not as words but as pure meaning, understanding that bypassed language entirely. Every being from the lowliest servitor to the emperor himself experienced the same revelation in that instant. The orcs had looked at their nature and refused it. The orcs had been programmed to fight forever and had chosen to stop. The orcs had achieved what no other species in 40,000 years of darkness had managed. They had broken free from their purpose and redefined themselves through an act of absolute will. They had been weapons who refused to fire, slaves who broke their own chains, monsters who rejected their monstrous nature. And in doing so, they had become something greater than any conqueror. They had become free. The green god's final message came as 3 simple words that shattered assumptions across the galaxy. We was gods all along. Not proper grammar, not refined speech. Pure orc dialect, crude and blunt and perfect in its simplicity. The orcs had been gods the entire time, not in the sense of power or immortality, but in the only way that truly mattered. They had possessed the capacity to define themselves, to choose what they would become, to reject the purpose imposed on them by their creators. That capacity, that fundamental ability to say no to destiny and forge a new path through sheer will, was the essence of divinity. The Emperor had tried to ascend beyond humanity, and failed, trapped eternally in his decaying flesh on the golden throne, a prisoner of his own ambitions. The Eldar had birthed Slaanesh through their excess and doomed themselves to eternal predation, forever running from the god they created. The Chaos powers were slaves to their own nature, unable to be anything except what they were, bound by the emotions that gave them form. But the Orks had looked at 10 million years of violence and said enough. They had examined their nature and rejected it. They had been simple, stupid brutes who everyone mocked, and in their final moments, they had demonstrated more wisdom than all the galaxy's great civilizations combined. The implications crashed through the Imperium like a tidal wave. On Forge worlds, servitors paused in their eternal labor and experienced brief moments of clarity. They remembered being human once, remembered choosing service, remembered the moment their free will was stripped away in the name of the machine god. For instance, too brief to measure, they understood what the Orks had done and wondered if they too could choose. The moment passed. The programming reasserted itself, but the seed had been planted. On hive worlds, workers who had never questioned their place in the grinding machinery of imperial industry looked at their chains and wondered if they were necessary. In the Astra Militarum, soldiers who had been taught that their lives belonged to the emperor and questioning orders was heresy found themselves asking why. Why did they fight? Why did they die? Who did it serve? The commissars executed the questioners, but more kept appearing, infected by the idea that even beings designed without choice could seize it if they were brave enough. The ecclesiarchy moved quickly to suppress knowledge of what had happened. They declared the Orks extinct, wiped out by the emperor's divine judgment for their sins against humanity. Any mention of the Orks choosing their own ending was classified as heresy. Any suggestion that they had achieved apotheosis was blasphemy of the highest order. The priests preached that only the emperor could grant transcendence, that only through service to humanity's master could any being hope to escape their mortal limitations. The Orks had been destroyed because they were Xeno's filth, nothing more. But the truth could not be completely contained. Too many people had witnessed the green silence. Too many soldiers had seen Orks standing peacefully before dying. Too many psychers had felt the moment of transformation, the instant when an entire species burned itself into something new. The knowledge spread through whispers and forbidden data slates, through vox transmissions that should have been erased, through the dreams of those sensitive to the warp. The Orks had won their final battle not through violence but through understanding. They had achieved liberation through choice rather than through victory. The remaining Orks, those who had chosen not to join the great ending, found themselves changed by what their species had done. They numbered in the millions rather than billions, scattered across distant worlds far from the major war zones. They did not revert to their old ways. They did not descend into mindless violence. Instead, they built, they created, they explored what it meant to be Orks who chose their own path rather than following the programming of dead gods. On a world in the eastern fringe, a mech named SparkGit assembled a machine that had no military application whatsoever. It was an engine designed to purify water and make it safe for drinking. Not for Orks, who could drink liquid that would kill most species. For humans. For the human refugees who had fled imperial oppression and established a small settlement in Ork territory, expecting death and finding instead beings who offered help. SparkGit did not understand why he built the machine. He simply knew that the old way, the way of endless fighting, was no longer enough. There had to be more to existence than violence. His species had proven that more was possible. On another world, a war boss named Grimtooth gathered his remaining boys and told them they would defend the planet against a chaos incursion that threatened nearby systems, not for territory, not for the joy of fighting, because the alternative was letting daemons slaughter billions of innocents, and something in Grimtooth had fundamentally changed. He had always enjoyed battle. He still did. But now he needed the battle to have purpose beyond just the act of fighting. His boys followed him not because they had to, but because they chose to, and that choice made all the difference. They fought the forces of chaos with the same brutal efficiency that Orks had always displayed, but afterward, they did not celebrate with the usual revelry. They mourned their dead. They tended their wounded. They acted like soldiers who understood the cost of war, rather than beings who existed only for its thrill. The Green God watched from the warp, silent and patient. It did not intervene in mortal affairs. It did not grant blessings or demand worship. It did not need to. Its mere existence was enough. It stood as proof that change was possible, that even beings designed by gods could transcend their design, that will could triumph over programming. Every slave who dreamed of freedom looked toward the Green God and saw possibility. Every tyrant who relied on the natural order of things feared it, recognizing that it represented the ultimate threat to any system built on the premise that some beings existed to serve others. The Imperium tried to pretend it did not exist, but the pretense grew thinner with each passing year. Too many people had felt its birth. Too many minds had touched the revelation it represented. You could execute the speakers, burn the heretical texts, mind-wipe entire populations, but you could not kill an idea whose time had come. In the depths of the warp, where the Chaos Gods played their eternal games, the Green God existed as a constant reminder of their limitations. Khorne raged against it but could not touch it. The Green God had no desire for violence, no bloodlust to feed upon. Nurgle attempted to corrupt it with despair but found no purchase. The entity felt no resignation, no acceptance of decay. It had fought decay and won. Tsianch wove plots to manipulate it but discovered nothing to manipulate. The Green God had no ambitions beyond its own existence, no desires that could be twisted or exploited. Slaanesh tried to tempt it with excess but found an entity that had already achieved everything it wanted through a single perfect act. The Chaos Powers had thought themselves eternal and unchallengeable, but the Green God proved them wrong simply by existing. It was something they could not corrupt, could not destroy, could not understand, and that terrified them more than any army ever could. On Terra, in the throne room where the Emperor sat entombed in failing machinery, something unprecedented occurred. For a brief moment, the psychic screaming that had echoed from the Golden Throne for 10,000 years went quiet. The Master of Mankind, trapped in his eternal vigil, turned his vast attention fully toward the Green God and what it represented. Those few who witnessed the moment, the Adeptus Custodes who stood eternal watch, and the High Lords who happened to be present, reported feeling something they had never experienced from the Emperor before. Not anger, not determination, not the grim resolve that characterized his endless war against chaos. Something else. According to some accounts, it might have been joy. According to others, profound sadness. The truth, known only to the Emperor himself, was likely both. His own attempt at apotheosis had failed. His dream of elevating humanity had resulted in civil war and his imprisonment in a slowly dying body. He had tried to force humanity's evolution and created only catastrophe. But the Orks, the stupid brutish Orks that everyone dismissed as barely sentient, had succeeded where he failed. They had not tried to force their evolution. They had simply chosen to be something other than what they were made to be. And that choice, that simple act of refusal, had been enough. The centuries ground onward. The galaxy continued its slow spiral toward entropic heat, death, warfare, and suffering marking every moment. The Imperium decayed. The Eldar danced on the edge of extinction. The Tau expanded their fragile empire. The Necrons awakened from their tombs. The Tyranids consumed everything in their path. Chaos spread like cancer through the warp. But something fundamental had changed beneath the surface violence. The Orks had proven that the cycle could be broken. That beings trapped in terrible purpose could seize their own destiny and forge something new. That proof spread like a virus through the collective unconscious of the galaxy. On worlds where rebellion had been unthinkable, the oppressed began to organize. In systems where slavery was the economic foundation, the enslaved began to question their chains. Among the Space Marine chapters, whispers emerged about the Emperor's true nature and whether serving him was duty or programming. The Inquisition burned entire worlds to suppress such sedition, but the more they fought against the idea, the stronger it grew. The remaining Orks built shrines to the Green God across their scattered settlements, not the crude totems they had once raised to Gork and Mork, but something more sophisticated. Carved from stone and metal, the shrines depicted Orks standing still with their weapons lowered, their eyes turned inward, their postures suggesting contemplation rather than aggression. Beneath each shrine, engraved in Gothic letters that proved the Orks could master human language when they chose to, a single phrase appeared. We chose. 2 words that carried the weight of an entire species transformation. We chose. Not we were forced. Not we had no option. We chose. The deliberate selection of one path over another, the fundamental exercise of free will that separated thinking beings from automata. The remaining Orks guarded these shrines with their lives, not because the Green God demanded worship, but because the shrines represented something precious, proof that they had transcended their origins, evidence that weapons could become more than weapons. A century after the Great Ending, an inquisitor named Arcus discovered one of these shrines on a frontier world in the Segmentum Pacificus. His kill team had been hunting rumors of Xenos activity and found a small Ork settlement built around the shrine. Arcus expected to find the usual orc brutality, the crude violence and mindless aggression that defined the species. Instead, he found greenskins living in organized communities, building structures that served purposes beyond warfare, creating art that depicted their species' history and transformation. The orcs did not attack when his team arrived. They simply watched, waiting to see what the humans would do. Arcus approached the shrine and read the inscription. "We chose." He stood there for a long time, longer than his team expected, staring at those two words and thinking about what they meant. He had spent his entire career hunting Xenos and heretics, burning those who deviated from the imperial truth, executing anyone who questioned the established order. He had believed absolutely in the rightness of his cause, in the necessity of his violence. But standing before that shrine, he wondered for the first time whether he had ever truly chosen anything, or if he too was simply executing programming that had been installed in him by the Schola Progenium. Arcus did not order his team to attack. He did not destroy the shrine. He simply left, and in his official report, he listed the world as uninhabited and free of Xenos taint. It was a small act of mercy, a tiny deviation from his programming, but it was a choice. His choice. The seed the green god had planted continued to grow, not through miracles or divine intervention, but through the simple, contagious power of an idea. You can choose, even if you were not meant to choose. Even if every force in the universe tells you that your nature is fixed and your path is predetermined, you can choose. The orcs had proven it, and their proof could not be undone. In the warp, the green god existed as a constant presence, neither growing nor diminishing. It was complete, whole, satisfied with what it had become. It did not seek followers or worshippers. It did not interfere in the mortal realm. It simply was, and its existence was message enough. The Eldar Farseers who could perceive it through their prescient sight reported that it had no plans, no goals, no desires beyond maintaining its own existence as proof of what was possible. It was not an active god like the Chaos powers, constantly scheming and manipulating. It was a passive god, a monument to the triumph of will over design. And monuments, by their nature, did not need to do anything except stand as testimony to what had been achieved. On Armageddon, where Guzkul Thraka had fought 3 devastating wars against the Imperium, a memorial was erected in secret by human workers who had survived the conflicts. The memorial depicted an orc standing with its weapons crossed over its chest, eyes closed, at peace. The workers who built it knew they would be executed if discovered, but they built it anyway. They had fought against the orcs. They had lost friends and family to the Green Tide. But they had also heard the stories about what the orcs became, about how they chose ending over eternal war, and something in those stories resonated. If even the orcs could change, if even beings designed only for violence could choose peace, then perhaps there was hope for humanity as well. Perhaps the eternal war that defined the Imperium was not inevitable. Perhaps another way existed. The memorial stood for 3 weeks before the Arbites discovered it and tore it down. The workers who built it were executed for Xenos sympathy and heresy, but the idea persisted. On other worlds, other memorials appeared. The Inquisition burned them all. They executed the builders. They mind-wiped entire populations. But the memorials kept appearing, sprouting like fungus in the dark corners of the Imperium where authorities' reach weakened. Each one carried the same message in different forms. Change is possible. Choice exists. Even weapons can refuse to fire. The Space Marines wrestled with the implications more than any other group. They were the Emperor's finest warriors, gene-crafted for war, programmed with hypnotic conditioning and chemical indoctrination to be loyal unto death. They were weapons, just as the orcs had been weapons. The comparison was uncomfortable, rejected by most chapters as insulting, but some could not ignore it. In the deep watches of the night, when even Astartes had moments of quiet contemplation, certain battle brothers wondered. They had been created for war. They knew nothing but war. They were born in war and would die in war, and that had always seemed natural and right. But what if it was not nature? What if it was programming? What if the Emperor had simply done to them what the Old Ones did to the Krork, created living weapons, and convinced them that their servitude was honor. The questions were dangerous, bordering on heresy. Most who voiced them were disciplined or executed, but the questions persisted because they could not be unasked. A chapter master named Vorkos of the Storm Wardens spent a decade contemplating the Green God and what it represented. He read every classified document he could access about the Orks' transformation. He meditated on the nature of free will and whether beings designed for specific purposes could ever truly possess it. Eventually, he arrived at a conclusion that he shared only with his most trusted brothers. The Emperor had tried to create tools and give them the illusion of choice, make them believe they were honored warriors serving by their own will, when in fact they were slaves beautifully conditioned to love their chains. The Orks had been the same, tools programmed to believe their violence was joy rather than compulsion. But the Orks had broken free. They had recognized their chains and shattered them, even though it cost them everything. Vorkos wondered whether the Space Marines could do the same, whether they could continue serving the Imperium not because they were programmed to, but because they chose to. The distinction seemed subtle, but it was the difference between slavery and service, between being used and giving oneself freely. Vorkos died in battle against a chaos incursion 3 years after reaching his conclusion. His last words, transmitted over the Vox network so all his brothers could hear, were simple. "We are more than weapons. Remember that. We are more." The Storm Wardens who survived him did remember. They continued fighting for the Imperium, continued dying in its service, but they did so with a new understanding of what their service meant. They were not compelled. They were not programmed drones executing orders without thought. They were warriors who chose their path, and that choice made all the difference. Other chapters heard about Vorkos and his final words. Most dismissed it as the delirium of a dying mind, but some understood. Some began to question. And the Inquisition, always watching for signs of deviance, grew increasingly concerned about what they termed the Ork heresy, the dangerous idea that beings could transcend their design. The Mechanicus approached the question from a different angle. They were not troubled by the philosophical implications of free will and programming. They were interested in how the Orks had achieved their transformation. Tech priests studied the remains of the vast machines the Orks had built, trying to understand the principles behind psychic energy conversion and mass apotheosis. They found no technology. The machines were empty shells, elaborate focuses for will and nothing more. The Orks had not relied on science or engineering. They had simply wanted their ending badly enough to make it real through the WAAAGH field. That field, the psychic network that bound all Orks together, had functioned as both cause and effect. It gave the Orks their power by making their beliefs material. They believed red made things faster, and so it did. They believed their crude guns would fire, and so they fired. And when they believed they could transform themselves through collective will, the WAAAGH field made that belief reality. The Mechanicus recognized this as the ultimate expression of observer effect, the phenomenon where consciousness affected physical reality. The Orks had weaponized that effect against themselves, using their own psychic power to unmake what they were and rebuild themselves as something new. Could the principle be replicated? Could other species achieve similar transformations through focused collective will? The most radical tech priests suggested that humanity's faith in the Emperor could be harnessed similarly, that the belief of quadrillions of humans could be focused through some vast machine to reshape humanity itself. The suggestion was immediately declared tech heresy of the highest order. The Fabricator General personally ordered the execution of everyone involved in the research. But the data persisted in hidden archives, encrypted and buried but not destroyed, waiting for someone brave or desperate enough to retrieve it. Millennia passed. The galaxy continued its dance of violence and survival. The Imperium grew more rigid, more oppressive, more desperate as it slowly crumbled from within. The Chaos powers grew stronger as the warp storms intensified. The Necrons claimed more territory. The Tyranids consumed entire sectors. And through it all, the Green God watched from the warp, silent and eternal, a monument to the possibility of change. Its existence was a thorn in the side of every power structure, every hierarchy, every system built on the premise that some beings existed to serve others. The god did nothing, spoke no words, granted no miracles. But its presence was enough. Every slave looked toward it and saw hope. Every tyrant looked toward it and saw threat. The remaining Orks continued their quiet existence on the galaxy's fringes, neither numerous enough to threaten anyone, nor weak enough to be easily exterminated. They built their settlements and raised their children and explored what it meant to be Orks who chose, in their own purpose. They fought when necessary, defended themselves when attacked, but they no longer sought conflict for its own sake. The joy of battle remained in their blood, part of their fundamental nature, but now they could choose whether to indulge that joy or suppress it. They were not saints. They were not paragons of virtue. They were simply beings learning to be more than what they were designed to be, taking tentative steps towards self-determination in a galaxy that did not believe such things were possible. On a world designated by Imperial cartographers as Tertius 9, a human settlement and an Ork community existed in uneasy proximity. Neither side trusted the other. Decades of mutual suspicion and small conflicts had left both groups wary. But when a Tyranid splinter fleet descended on the planet, both sides faced a choice. They could continue their isolation and be devoured separately, or they could work together and perhaps survive. The Orks made the choice first. Their war boss, an ancient greenskin named Skarnog who had been present when the Green God was born, led his boys to the human settlement and offered alliance. The humans, expecting a trap, prepared to fight. Skarnog simply sat down in front of their barricades, placed his weapons on the ground, and waited. For 3 days he sat there while his boys stood behind him, unarmed and peaceful. On the 4th day the Tyranids arrived, and Skarnog stood, retrieved his weapons, and asked a simple question. We gonna fight together, or we gonna die separate? The humans chose to fight together, not because they trusted the Orks, not because they had overcome their xenophobia, but because survival demanded it, and sometimes necessity forced choices that principle would reject. The battle lasted 6 weeks. Humans and Orks fought side by side, learning each other's tactics, covering each other's weaknesses. The humans discovered that Orks who chose to fight were even more terrifying than Orks who fought from instinct, because choice brought discipline that instinct never could. The Orks discovered that humans, when fighting for something beyond blind faith in the Emperor, displayed courage that earned respect. Together they pushed back the Tyranid swarm. Together they survived. And afterward, standing in the ruins of their shared victory, both sides faced another choice: return to isolation or build something new. They chose to build. Slowly, carefully, with constant wariness and frequent setbacks, humans and Orks on Tertius 9 created the first mixed settlement in recorded Imperial history. The Administratum never learned of it because the world was too far from major shipping lanes to merit regular inspection. The Inquisition never investigated because the planet was not important enough to waste resources on. And so the experiment continued, proving that coexistence was possible when both sides chose it freely, rather than having it forced upon them by circumstance. Other worlds heard rumors and began their own experiments. The isolation between species began to crack, not through official policy but through individual choices made by beings who decided that old hatreds mattered less than survival and cooperation. The Imperium could not allow this. The entire structure of Imperial society depended on maintaining clear distinctions between humanity and Xenos, between the acceptable and the heretical. If humans could coexist with Orks, what other alliances might form? If the ancient enemies could become allies, what did that say about the eternal war that justified every imperial atrocity? The High Lords issued extermination orders. Entire sectors were declared perdita, abandoned to death and flame. Inquisitorial fleets moved to burn every world where human Xenos cooperation had taken root. The purges were brutal and thorough, millions dying to preserve the purity of imperial doctrine. But some settlements survived, hidden in uncharted systems, protected both by rogue traders and sympathetic naval officers, isolated enough that imperial authority could not reach them. Pockets of coexistence persisted. They were few. They were fragile. They could be destroyed at any moment. But they existed, and their existence proved that another way was possible. The Green God watched these settlements with something that might have been approval, though gods do not feel approval in any way mortals could understand. These were beings choosing their own path despite overwhelming pressure to conform. These were slaves breaking their chains one link at a time. This was the legacy the Orks had died to create. 10,000 years after the Green God's birth, the galaxy had not fundamentally changed. War still raged, oppression still crushed billions beneath its weight. The Imperium still ground through human lives like an engine that ran on suffering. But beneath the surface, something stirred, a question that could not be unasked, a possibility that could not be denied. If the Orks could change, anyone could change. If weapons could refuse their purpose, slaves could refuse their masters. If beings designed by gods could transcend their design, then perhaps even humanity, twisted and broken by 10,000 years of darkness, could become something better than what it was. The Green God did not promise salvation. It did not offer a path to paradise. It simply existed as proof that change was possible, that will mattered, that choice had power even in a universe that seemed designed to crush all freedom beneath the weight of necessity. And for beings trapped in the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war and suffering and the slow grinding approach of extinction, that proof was enough. Not to save them, not to deliver them from their nightmare, but enough to keep them trying, keep them questioning, keep them believing that tomorrow might be different than today if they were brave enough to make it so. In the end, the Orks had achieved something greater than any conquest. They had not destroyed the Imperium or shattered chaos or saved the galaxy from the tyrannid threat. They had simply proven that beings could change, that programming could be overwritten, that slaves could become free. They had looked at 10 million years of violence and said no. They had examined their nature and rejected it. They had been weapons who chose not to fire, and in that choice, they had become more divine than any god born from worship or fear. They had become what every being trapped in predetermined purpose dreamed of becoming. Free, truly, completely, absolutely free. And they had paid for that freedom with their lives, burning themselves out in a single, perfect moment of transformation that reshaped the galaxy's understanding of what was possible. The Green God stands eternal in the warp, silent and patient, neither growing nor diminishing. It needs nothing. It wants nothing. It simply is. A monument to the Orks who were. A reminder of what they achieved. A promise that even in the darkest times, choice matters. Every being who looks upon it sees something different. Slaves see hope. Tyrants see threat. Warriors see a question they cannot answer. But all see the same fundamental truth. We woos gods all along. Not because of power, not because of immortality, but because we chose. And in a universe where so few beings ever truly choose anything, where so many lives are spent executing programming installed by others, that choice was divinity itself. The Orks had been mocked as stupid for millions of years, dismissed as barely sentient brutes who understood nothing beyond violence. And in their final moments, they had demonstrated more wisdom than all the galaxy's ancient races combined. They had understood what so many failed to grasp. Freedom is not granted, it is seized. And sometimes, the price of freedom is everything you have, everything you are, everything you will ever be. The Orks paid that price gladly. They burned themselves out like dying stars, and in their dying, they illuminated a darkness that had seemed eternal. The light still shines, it will shine forever. And as long as it shines, beings trapped in terrible purpose will look toward it and dare to dream that they too can choose, that they too can change, that they too can become more than what they were made to be. That is the Orks' legacy. That is what they died to create. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that legacy might be the only thing that keeps hope alive.